And Sydney will kick us off.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to our Teacher Data Task Force meeting today. We'll go ahead and get started. If you can go to the next slide, Kathy. It would probably be helpful for me to introduce myself. My name is Sydney Armendariz. I'm the Chief of Strategic Initiatives and Partnerships here at Cradle-to-Career. I'm filling in for Marianne Bates, our Executive Director today, because she is out of the office this week. So nice to see everyone. And now if you can go to the next slide.
I am a little confused because it's showing that it's on the next slide.
Uh-oh.
Let me actually just stop the share and redo it.
Okay.
The Microsoft fix. There we go.
Yep, I see it too. Okay, so for today's process, we do ask our task force members, whenever possible, if you can unmute yourself and speak your comments, because if you type your comments into the chat, we will pause periodically to read chat comments, but if you unmute yourself to share your comments, that would be a lot easier so we can make sure that we don't miss you in chat. Community members, you are invited to submit public comment in advance of these meetings to the Office of Cradle-to-Career Data via email, and the email is on the slide. It's info@c2c.ca.gov. You can also make comments via chat during the meeting. But we do ask that everyone please keep your lines muted if you're not speaking, just to reduce background noise. And just a note, if you see an A in front of your name, that's just our team renaming all task force members with the letter A and a semicolon, an A and a colon, to allow us to easily identify who the task force members are versus who community members are. Next slide, please. So the goals for today's meeting are to first clarify the purpose of this task force, and then to evaluate data points for the following topics, so teacher placement and then teacher retention, and then to determine how to finalize agency level definitions for data points that are not yet defined. So we have Kathy Booth from West Ed today, who is going to facilitate today's meeting. We here at C2C have asked her to host these meetings on our behalf because she has the institutional knowledge and the background knowledge that we definitely don't have. So that's why I'm turning it over to Kathy today to host our meeting. But of course, if you have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat or to send us an email at that info inbox as well. So Kathy, I will turn it over to you.
Great, thank you so much. All right, so just to get us all grounded, I sort of want to remind everyone what we're trying to do here. So there's a list of questions that were identified by a committee more than a year ago when we were first coming up with the idea of creating a dashboard that looks at the pipeline to teachers training and then through their placement in K-12 public schools and their retention in those schools. And so each of these questions has something that really requires that we create a formula or bringing together specific data points, sometimes from multiple providers. And the way that you construct a metric is really important to make sure it's going to answer the question as intended. So what we've done is we've taken the questions that were pre-approved and shared with the governing board for C2C, and we're just breaking them down to say, well, how would we construct a metric to answer the question that's listed? So what you'll note is we're going to be working in a GDoc, a sort of Google Sheet, and that will make that link available to everybody so you can scroll up and down and sort of be in control of what you're seeing. And that there's things that are going to be repeated because we're going to use the same elements. We're going to combine them in different ways to answer different questions. So that's why things may seem a little bit redundant. What we've done is we've sort of noted anytime a metric appears, we're going to discuss some of those metrics individually today because we got some very helpful feedback from CDE. Thank you so much for taking the time to go through this list with a fine-tooth comb in advance. So we're going to discuss some of those things together. And so that's really going to be the focus of the meeting. And again, just a couple of reminders that There are other resources that have been created, particularly together by CDE and CTC. And this dashboard that we're going to be creating as part of Cradle-to-Career is intended to supplement those other resources. And that really the audience for the dashboard that we're creating is going to be members of the public. So it may be that there are much more technical definitions that get constructed in the dashboards that CDE and CTC do together because they're responding to federal reporting requirements. There may be research studies that others create that may have more variables, but we're really trying to look at things that an average person could look at and begin to understand how well we're doing as a state in filling a good pipeline of potential teachers, given how many people are retiring right now, both because of the pandemic and also because of just sort of the graying out of our teacher workforce. So that's our intent. The things that we're going to be doing as we look at these elements is I'm asking the experts from each of the data providers to be really thinking through which specific data points are needed, which data provider is the right entity to provide that information. We have separate documentation from each of the data providers about every one of these building blocks, the individual elements that will be combined to create these metrics. And so we're just getting some notes from folks, and we'll be following up offline with them to make sure their documentation is complete for the C2C staff. And we'll be talking a little bit about some key considerations when C2C is building out these dashboards. All right, so a couple of things about how to read what's in the document. I've already talked a little bit about how they're broken down, but there's some highlighting in them. So if it's in yellow, it means that we do not yet have the data definition, and we don't yet have those items covered in the legal agreement with the data providers. If it's in lavender, it means we do have the definitions, but it's not in the participation agreement. And green ones are things that already have data definitions and are in the participation agreement. So that's what the color coding means. All right, any questions before we go into the document itself from our task force members? Okay, hearing none, I'm going to switch which screen I'm using, and I'm going to share the one that's in front of me. Get the dashboard up. All right. And I'm going to enable chat on my other machines so that I can see what questions you all have. All right, and so Rajiel, because I will be looking up at the screen, if there are things showing up in chat and I'm not responding to them, please unmute and just let me know to go look at chat. All right, so for starters, I actually want to begin with row 99 here. So one of the things that we realized in discussions is that we were using some wording that might be misleading. So we had a question originally here that was stated, how are people receiving teaching credentials, demonstrating subject matter competency, and other required skills? And one of the concerns is that when we use terms like competency, it implies that Cradle-to-Career could be used to evaluate individual educators, which is not the intent of this dashboard at all. Really what we're trying to do is help understand how teachers in general are getting prepared to go into schools so that we just have a better understanding of particularly how subject matter expertise for this particular item is being generated. So in our last meeting, we had talked about potentially including a data point from CDE about individual teachers' employment status. But what we've had is a request that, first of all, we reword the question to make it clearer, which is really, we're looking for information on how people that are receiving teaching credentials are meeting the requirements for subject matters. So it's really about that process of credentialing, as opposed to anything specific to what's happening once they're placed. So this is an important one for CTC to weigh in on, because I think that it was your team that thought this might be useful to have information from CDE. So could we answer the question as currently rephrased with just those items in yellow? I invite our CTC folks to unmute and share.
Hi, Kathy. Based on how you have reworded, we do subject matter has different options for candidates to meet. So are we trying to find out which options they used in order to get their credential? For example,
Exactly.
meeting the subject matter program, passing the CSETs, or the subject matter exams, using the degree major coursework, combination of coursework and exam.
Yes,
We
that's
do
exactly.
have a list of those. It is a new field that we are collecting, field data point that we are collecting now. As of, I believe, like July 1st of last year is when some of the new options were approved. So we do currently have, or we can find out how many are meeting subject matter by exam and by program. But with the new options like degree major and coursework, we won't have that data yet.
Okay, well, why don't we start with what you do have? So what is the appropriate name of that data point?
So we have it called subject code, subject description. That's how we can identify it. But we also have a new field, which we're currently researching on for our own purposes. But currently what I use is subject code, subject description.
Okay. So this is a good point to remind people how we're making decisions about what data points are included in Cradle-to-Career. So things that are brand new and experimental are not good candidates for going into the dashboard, because generally new data points take a little while to sort of get seasoned, for everyone to be sure that they're really measuring what you think they're measuring. So there's been a number of cases where we have flagged a data point where we're like, this is probably a really good one to have, but we're going to need to wait a little bit until we know it's of good quality. So Beth, who's taking notes, will indicate that we can follow up with you about the point at which it would be appropriate to include that new data element once you've certified that it's in good shape. Follow up on that one. Are there any other thoughts that others have about this particular question and its rephrasing or the data points?
Yeah, hi Kathy, this is Paul Tuss. I have a question about, I know that this data point is relatively new and we don't want to bring it into the public dashboard until we're confident that it is accurate and reflects the information we want. But I wonder whether it's still possible to include it in the data set. It seems to have important policy implications for decisions around how we're measuring subject matter competency and whether it's whether different pathways are as effective as others.
Absolutely. If you feel confident about putting it in, or you can even set guardrails around how it does or doesn't get used. But so what's the name of that element then?
Well, I think that's a CTC data element.
But I just want to make sure that I've got its name down in this field. What's it called? Or is there a placeholder name I could use for it?
Or CTC?
I think we're talking about how a subject matter competency requirement is being met, either by coursework or passing an assessment.
Right.
Well, for CTC, I guess you can temporarily put it as a subject matter qualification route. I think that's what our field is, but that could change.
Okay.
That's where we have all of the options listed, including the new ones like the coursework and degree major.
Okay. Liberty.
Kathy, I appreciate your comment about the kind of need to test new data elements, but it raises a question for me in that if we have existing pathways, for lack of a better word, to reach subject matter competency that we are not measuring, are we really going to be able to answer that question fully?
So let's talk through like what that would mean. So you're more familiar with these data points than I am. So using the data points that are there, do you think there would be useful information that would be generated that could just help us begin to understand how people are demonstrating that competency? Or do you feel like it could be misleading?
I am not familiar enough to know for sure. From what I'm seeing right here, either it's an exam or through coursework. Is that correct?
Subject matter program.
Which is how I did it. I did it through that in my bachelor's program, had it embedded in it. I'm familiar with that one, and I did not have to take the tests. But for people who did not go one of those two routes, are we gonna not see them in the data? Do we need to have like another, I guess with all of the changes coming down the pike, is this enough information to tell us how teachers are meeting the requirements without including those new elements that CTC is working to get? Does that make sense?
Well, prior to July 1st of last year, I believe,
It was.
candidates have to meet either the program or the exam or pass the exam. So we will have that data.
Perfect.
It's just that after July 1st, we'll have the other options that candidates can meet the subject matter, and we won't have the full 1 year data of that yet. But they have to meet either a subject matter program or exam prior to last year, definitely.
That makes sense.
So we can flag that there's a new policy context, and that we'll have to look at how we're addressing that shift, and then also then how that gets described. Because when the number of data points changes, it can be confusing if people are looking at a time trend, for example. So we can note that. Ed.
And I was pretty much where you were, Kathy, on that. Maybe the way you work through that is to contemplate a construct of a trend in new versus a trend or what the overall population is in any given year, in differentiating those. But you're almost certainly going to have to come up with a footnote, because things like these have a tendency to lag in and sometimes overtake, sometimes don't, but also sometimes diminish one or the other of the existing processes.
That's a great note. Okay, so again, we're going to be doing a user-centered design process once we really know what data elements are going to come in, where we'll be talking to the public, understanding better what questions they're trying to answer and the ways they're thinking about these issues. So this is a great thing for us to sort of flag, because I'm sure there's people that'll be interested from a policy point of view about the impact of this shift. So that's a really helpful note. Anything else on this particular topic? Okay, then we're going to be moving on to the question of unmet demand, which is actually going to take us back up. Don't get dizzy. We're going to go to row 54, which is the first time that this issue comes up. So what I want to just double check is whether we've got the right approach to that, which is teachers with permits, waivers, and interns. And I'm raising this question for CDE because they weren't at the last meeting at the point that we were discussing this. And so I just want to see if there's any concerns about that from our CDE colleagues.
Kathy, can you restate what the question is?
So the issue is that a couple of the questions are looking for the issue of unmet demand. So we're trying to figure out basically if there's areas where we don't have enough teachers, are there people that are training to fill those gaps that are sufficient for the need? And so in the last meeting, we said that maybe the best way to describe subjects with unmet demand is to be looking at teachers with permits, waivers, or interns within the content area code, for example. So I'm looking at rows 52 and 54 for this one. And I just wanted validation from the CDE team that you agreed with this approach.
Jonathan, chime in if you have anything else to add, but I think that's part of it. I think there's more to it than that. If we're talking about unmet demand, what about vacancies? And permits, waivers, and interns are not vacancies. So I think it's a little incomplete in my view. What do you think, Jonathan?
No, I would concur, Liberty. And I mean, you could potentially look at the permits and waivers as a harbinger of, trends, but yeah, vacancies is probably going to give you a more kind of direct relationship, I would think.
And is that a data point that CDE collects?
Well, it's calculated in connection with data that we receive from CTC in terms of the CalSAS. It's connected together, so it's a calculated field basically.
Okay. But where does it reside? Is that once it's calculated, like does CTC calculate it, or once you combine the data sets, does it become a calculated field?
It's combined, yeah. So right now, Kathy, it's pretty complicated because it only lives right now on the school accountability report card.
Okay.
But like for this last round where we did the match, and remember, this is the first match we've ever done with our data in CalSAS. There was only, I can't remember Liberty off the top of my head, but it was like 100 and something Liberty vacancies for the whole state, which, so it's not, it's in our assignment monitoring outcomes report as well on DataQuest. So it's in the SARCs and it's in the DataQuest report as well, but it's really low number right now.
So would that be something appropriate to share for this dashboard or not?
I would encourage the exploration of that new report, because there are a number of different variables that we report in that could be used to answer these questions.
Okay.
And the data that are used to populate that report is CDE data and CTC data, and the calculations are done on our end.
Yeah.
Jonathan, do we provide that back to CTC? I'm sorry, I don't know the answer to that, but
I think we basically just posted it. I don't think Fifi, you might be able to in a better position, but I think we just posted it publicly. But Kathy, while we're all talking here, I will put a link in the chat to where that new report is on our webpage too.
Wonderful. So this is a really good example of where we'll do some follow-up after this meeting and just clarify how we want to construct that as we prep for next steps.
And Kathy, I would change that to not say vacancies, but to say unmet need. Is probably, yeah.
Right.
Great, thank you. Any other changes you'd want to make on this particular row? Okay, there's one other place in the document that this appears, which is line 83. So I'm just going to duplicate our documentation for that. Okay. Our next one is a concept that appears all over this spreadsheet. So I'm going to fix it once and I'm going to go back after this meeting and fix it. So one of them has to do with the issue of the location of a teacher. And when we were first discussing this with an advisory group that was supporting the planning, there was a real interest in having data being available at the school site. We got feedback from CDE that it would be more appropriate to use the LEA as the smallest unit based on how data is structured within the data set that CDE manages. So I just wanted to talk through that. So the case that makes this, that makes us most clear is LA Unified. So there's lots and lots and lots of school sites within that LEA. I just want to check in with CDE. Can you clarify, is it possible to get below LAUSD in your data sets, or are we really at that LEA level, or am I mischaracterizing how data is structured?
Kathy, this is Jonathan. I think one of the comments that we actually provided back to you all in the spreadsheet late last week that Cindy sent out, we're really encouraging our looks to be at the LEA level. That doesn't mean that we cannot, it doesn't mean we don't have data drilled down to the school level, but just the way that the data are reported and collected within CalPads, et cetera, it makes more sense. Our frame at least makes more sense to look at this at the LEA level across pretty much all of the different categories. And I know that was what some of the feedback we had sent late last week as well to Marianne and to you all.
Right. So talk me through what happens with LA Unified. Would there be, I mean, does that mean you would just see all the LA schools as one option?
Yeah, I mean, it's just all of those schools within that district aggregated. Again, when you get to data quest reports or downloadable files for a lot of these different reports, you can then still filter by school level, right? But just in terms of that core level reporting, it's going to be at the LEA level. But yes, definitely when you get on onto data quest and you've selected LA Unified, like for the teacher assignment report, you can then filter by school level.
So what's the right thing to do for this dashboard? Again, remembering it's the general public that are going to be looking at it.
Well, is the question about unmet shortage areas at a school, or is it
Let me actually
shortage
get down
areas for
to the
teachers?
next one.
Okay, thank you.
153. So 153. So the first place this is showing up is what kind of jobs do newly credentialed teachers get in California public schools? But this data point is going to show up over and over again as we're looking at the question of teacher placement. So for example, if we're looking at the issue of do the teachers that are placed resemble the students that they are teaching, that's another place where we're going to look at, would we be looking at LA Unified or would we be looking at a school site within LA?
So I'm sorry, are you on the question that shows up in row 144?
Yes. What type of jobs do newly credentialed teachers get in California public schools, in which one of these questions we'd originally put down that this was going to be at the school level. And that's where we'd gotten feedback from you that it might be better to do this at the LEA level. And I'm looking at every single instance of this data point, the concept of a K-12 public school. So you may not have given feedback on this particular question,
Yeah.
but my thought is we should have parallel construction across all of the questions that you could get answered on the dashboard.
I think it depends on the question. And so I appreciate that kind of approach of consistency across the questions very, very much. But it does vary depending on the question. So that you were mentioning, do the teachers look like the kids that they're teaching? That's a very different question than what types of jobs do newly credentialed teachers get in California public schools. I think, not to get too far into the weeds, but one of the things that show up in that we see in schools and in districts are teachers that are not assigned to a school all the time, a lot. So we have teachers that are coaches, we have teachers that are teaching at 4 different school sites. And so the complexity of that I don't know that it's something that we can necessarily address by looking at the school level. You would need to pull it back up to the LEA level if you're for this question of what types of jobs.
So one of the things that we got was some feedback from CDE about which questions might be more appropriate to answer at the LEA level. And unfortunately, I don't have that document open, so I can't cross-reference in this moment. Maybe what we can do is just really quickly go through these different instances. Liberty, do you have that documentation open?
The questions that we provided?
Yeah.
I do, I have it.
Oh, wonderful. So maybe we can just go through, I've got all the rows down, and maybe we can just go one by one and figure out which is appropriate at the LEA level and which is appropriate at the school site. So for this issue of what type of jobs do they get, you're saying this is better at the LEA level because people may not be assigned.
I'm saying I don't know specifically on all of the different questions. I wasn't approaching it that way.
I see. So let's take this a different way. One possibility is that when we're doing the user-centered design process, or when we're first constructing the data sets before we take it out for the user input, we could go through this with CDE and figure out which ones really are the places where it makes more sense to do it at the LEA level versus the school site, rather than taking time on this call, so that you can sort of look at it all in context. Does that sound like a better solution?
Yes.
So what I'm going to do is just flag that we're going to take a look at each of the questions with CDE and figure out what's right. I've noted that in chat, there's a couple of comments with some folks from the public saying there are times when there are questions that are really important by school site, but also that there's other variables that might influence what is the appropriate answer. So for example, the idea that the type of credential that someone obtains might also shift where the right places to look for the grain size of school, LEA, et cetera. So we'll go ahead and take a look at those offline. Any other thoughts on this topic?
Well, this is Paul Tuss. I would like to have some input at some point into those determinations about which questions are better answered at the LEA versus school level.
Okay.
Thanks.
How about this? Because I've gotten notes from others saying there's times when they would prefer it's at the LEA level, and others that are saying that it's really important that there's a lot of feedback about this. Why don't we have sort of like a homework assignment that Westside will put together for each of the data providers to indicate what you think would be the right grain size for each of these questions. And then that will we'll do documentation about why it is that you feel that it might be better at one level versus another. So for example, Liberty is a very important point that if you'll have a lot of missing information at the school site level because there are teachers that are not assigned, that we would know that. And then when we do the user-centered design process, we can sort of check this with the community to clarify, well, we can't provide the data at this level. The other thing that's really important, based on like Jonathan's statement, that in DataQuest, there are times where you've got the LEA and then you've got the option for the drill down. We could be doing something similar. So by choosing school site, that doesn't mean you don't have LEA as an option, because the idea is that the drop-down menus allow the user to select the geography. So it might be that you want to look at an entire region, you know, like the Bay Area. So there's, or like if you were in LA, you might want to include some of the ring, you know, colleges, or sorry, not colleges, but the ring suburbs around LA proper. So there's probably a number of different variables that we'd want to take a look at. So does that feel right? Like, Paul, would that address your concern?
Yeah, that's an excellent approach.
Okay. Any other thoughts on this topic? Okay, then I'm going to move on to another data point that shows up specific, like in many, many different questions, which has to do with the staff job classification code. So I'm going to move us up to row 113, which is the first time this appears. So people teaching in a K-12 public school. And this is related for the first time to the question about whether newly credentialed teachers are reflecting the students in the schools that they're teaching. So in this case, we had a recommendation from CDE that more than just the staff job classification code, we want to get more specific and say that we are only looking at staff with FTE-based classroom assignments. So I want to double check with CDE. This is basically determining which of the variables associated with this data point that you'd like to have considered. Is that correct? So I don't know, Liberty or Jonathan, if you want to weigh in on this.
Yeah, I'm looking again, Kathy, at this is for 113, 114.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's it's two separate things, right? Because basically, you know, we're getting them from two sources, right? So the race ethnicity of students in line 116, that obviously comes from CalPADS.
Right.
And I know that that's listed in several of the other research questions below. That's not an issue or a problem at all. And in terms of race ethnicity of teachers, that's also collected in CalPADS, but in a different, differently. So I guess the question is, you're not really asking about the race ethnicity, you're asking about
the job classification code. So the idea that we're constraining it to specifically, and I'm quoting from the documentation,
right.
Staff with FTE based classroom assignments.
Correct, right, because we're looking, because I'm assuming the question is focusing on the actual classroom instructors, right? We're not, is that right?
Well, so this raises a question, and I see that Ed's got his hand raised, because earlier Ed had suggested that we could include other types of training that people are getting in CSU related to becoming an administrator, for example. So Ed, were you going to weigh in on that?
I think the other piece of this, and I don't know how districts differentiate. I do know down here in Los Angeles, we used to hear a lot about high school teachers who are credentialed, but are not in teaching roles. They have to report to a district site because they've been pulled from classrooms. And so what I thought when I heard the conversation, that you may be just kind of drawing those off of the record, or I don't know how you're planning on handling those, or whether or not there'd be a differentiating code on those. That's where I was going with it. I think that's maybe a nuance, and maybe only in larger districts, but you could run into that if the construct was FTS instructional versus FTS in sort of a teaching capacity, but not in a teaching capacity.
So this seems very similar to the point we made just a moment ago about why LEA might be the appropriate grain size for information. What are your thoughts about the constraint of that FTE-based classroom assignment designation? I don't know if Jonathan or Liberty, you want to weigh in on this one.
I think it goes back to what that granularity again of, and you know, it may only be something you see in a larger district, but it does exist in the data, and we do have to have an approach to how to handle that, which is teachers that are not classroom based. And I see a question in the chat. Someone is saying it would be valuable to have data on administrators and counselors. So are we only talking about teachers here? And if so, how to address those that are not classroom based? Is that a question that we want to see answered in the data?
So if we're opening up the training routes to include people that are training to become administrators, as CSU has suggested, then it seems like it might be worthwhile to look at all of it. I'm going to pull all the way back out to the vision for Cradle-to-Career, which is that one of its reasons for existence is to look at ways that we can address equity gaps. And certainly there's a lot of literature about the difference it makes to have leadership that reflects who the students are. I would imagine as counseling becomes more and more critical to how we're helping students navigate, that might also be a variable. So I'm curious whether, like, for the CDE folks, do you have the ability to provide information that would break it out by other roles like counselor or administrator?
Yes.
So really what we'd be doing is maybe expanding the question itself from newly credentialed teachers to having sub-questions that allow you to pick, like maybe this becomes educators, and then you can pick the role.
I think that would be possible with the data.
Okay.
I think.
So why don't we have a note that we go back and have you all take a look at it with the folks, like the whole data team, to figure out the implications of expanding the question in that way. And that can be one of our homework assignments. Does that sound appropriate?
Sounds good to me.
And then I'm curious for the CSU and the CTC folks, is it also of interest to go beyond classroom teachers to look at some of these other roles based on concerns that your agencies have?
I think from talking to the deans of education, they are interested in the full spectrum of educator credentials beyond just teachers.
Yes, same here for CTC.
Great. So this seems like it would be really beneficial if the data is going to be strong enough to support it.
Yeah. And this is Jonathan. We've gotten ad hoc data requests from folks in the past, from researchers asking about composition, racial ethnic composition of non-teach, of administrators, et cetera, as well. So there is an interest out there for sure.
Great. So I'm going to put just a parenthetical, expand to educators, including administrators and counselors. All right.
The one thing that comes to mind though, Kathy, is, we haven't gotten to a place where we're discussing visualizations and dashboard layouts and so forth, but I can just envision some visualizations that pertain to teachers and some that pertain to other credential areas like administrators.
Right. And one of the things that'll be very important is that process of the design based on clarity about how users are like what they're trying to understand. And we don't have to deal with that now, but as you probably know from having worked on dashboards, like if you haven't figured out the data points and made sure they're there, that it's really disappointing when you get out and you talk to the community and they're like, well, what if you had this visualization and we don't really have that figured out yet, especially because we want to make sure that we're abiding by that. Like in the mission is that this is a reliable source of information and only the data providers really know what's most reliable in your own data sets. Okay. All right, so I'm just double checking chat and I'm seeing that, yeah, there's definitely a lot of interest with the idea of expanding this to educators. So great. Okay, any other thoughts on the job classification codes? Okay, and once again, when we do the homework assignment, we'll take a look at how this fits into each of the specific research questions because there's quite a number of them that have this in it. Okay, so now we're actually going to look at the concept of an employment date. So for this, I'm going to scroll down to line 142. And that has to pertain to the question that's on line 134. Which is how many years does it take newly credentialed teachers to get jobs in California public schools? One of the things that CDE suggested is that the Cradle-to-Career could be the entity that is actually calculating both the earliest date of employment and then from that starting point, the length of employment, with the idea being that there are some questions about some of the data points there, that it would be easier for C2C to take all of this and just do those calculations. So I just want to invite our colleagues from CDE just to clarify that request. Did I characterize that correctly about the idea that it would be Cradle-to-Career that is doing that calculation?
I think considering that no single entity has all of the information to be able to make that calculation, I think at this point, C2C would be the only entity that really could do that. But I don't know if others feel differently.
For the CTC folks, does that sound good to you?
Yeah, because in our system, we would only know who were credentialed. So we wouldn't even have any data past really that point.
Mm-hmm.
So any additional data that you would get from CDE in terms of employment, I think maybe C2C can make the calculations.
Great. Okay. And then CSU, do you have any concerns about that?
So maybe what I just put in there, just think about what your timing element is.
Yes, you are predicting the next question I'm going to ask you.
So, it's the how good is the data going back is going to be the critical aspect of this, because you could end up in a position where you don't have very meaningful data earlier, or you have data that are confounded by sort of just anomalies that are beyond your control.
Great. So then when we do the follow-up with CDE on this data point, we'll just double check the earliest year in which you feel the data is really reliable. Okay. Any other comments on this approach?
Kathy?
Yes.
I just have, I guess, a clarification. So the question is newly credentialed teachers to get a job in California, right? So if, for example, a person, worked as an intern, that intern won't be counted as the first year they got a job, right? It will be when they get their preliminary credentials when we start counting.
That's a really good point. So what we have in the construction here, and we're going to come in a minute and look at people who earned a credential and how that variable is defined in a moment. But yes, you could set something up in the formula that says start from the year credentials, then search for the first year of employment, so that even if they were an intern, that's not going to get captured. But that would be a really important thing to note for that calculation.
Right.
Anything else on this item? Okay, so now we're going to work on the idea of earning a credential and the concept of being newly credentialed. So the first place that earning a credential shows up is in row 124. So this is where I need to get some input from CTC. What is the variable name for people who earn a credential in your data set?
I'm not sure what you mean by variable name.
So if
Because
we're going to do a calculation, like what information would we get from you that would help us know who are the people? Is that the seed?
Not necessarily the seed, because when a person comes into our system, they will get a seed, but that doesn't mean that they got a credential. For example, they could apply for the certificate clearance. So we have multiple fields, I guess, that determines whether a person was issued a credential. So we have like a doc title, we have a doc term, we have other data elements that where we determine a person received a credential. That's something that we can provide to you, I think, in a spreadsheet.
Okay. So then this is going to be a data point that you're going to construct and submit to Cradle-to-Career.
That is something we can, yes.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and put it in both places. Great. The next variable that we need to figure out is the concept of newly credentialed. So this was a question that Ed raised in our last meeting. So is there a standard variable? Like how much time is it, like within the same year, by the following academic year? How is that normally determined?
We have a field that lets us know if the credential was, if the document is newly issued to a person. But it could be at the credential level. For example, a person can get multiple teaching credentials, multiple subject and a single subject education specialist. So we do have data elements that will indicate, this person got a new multiple subject, got a new single subject, got a new education specialist. But if you were to look at a person and their credential history, you will see that they have 3 instead of saying, oh, they're a new teacher. Does that make sense? So if we're only looking at credential, we do have a field that can determine that at the document level.
And what's that called?
Document category.
Okay. So we talked earlier about the idea that we really want to follow it for each credential, because that's part of how we're understanding the pipeline of supply and demand. So let's say I was credentialed in one area, but I then could not fulfill a demand in another area because I was not yet qualified. And then I went back and I did some training, and then I became newly credentialed, and now I'm available to help fill that need. And that's why we want to do this at the credential level. So is it possible to do it in that fashion?
Yes.
Great. Any other thoughts about the idea of being newly credentialed? And just for clarity, what is the time frame for being newly credentialed? Do you know?
5 years for preliminary. Yeah, I think most preliminary credentials expire within 5 years, and then they have to get their clear credential.
Thank you.
Kathy, this is Liberty. Is the question about how new their credential is, or is it how new they are in the classroom?
I think it's really, I mean, the way that it was constructed was with the credential, but I'd welcome comments from others about what would be most useful. I mean, in this case, it's really our folks that are just coming into teaching. Let me actually, let's look at the actual construction of this question. How does the racial ethnic composition of newly credentialed teachers vary by the geographic location of the schools where they teach? So you're right, Liberty. This is really more about people that are just entering the classroom, which is more about the tipping of things. But when we open this up to the idea of educators, I don't know, like, are there cases where people go from being a teacher to an administrator? I can think of those. But you don't need do you need a credential to be an administrator? Is that something? Okay.
Yes.
So just play that out for me, for those of you who are content experts. What's more useful, the timing to the credential or the experience in the classroom?
Hi, this is Paul. I'm pretty sure we're talking about new teachers who are working as teachers of record in the classroom, or new administrators who are new to their role, not new to earning their credential, but not employed in any kind of an educational context.
You're a little bit faint, Paul. Do you say that again?
Yeah, I think we're most interested in people who are new to being employed as a teacher of record or an administrator in a school or LEA. Not someone who just earned their credential but isn't working. That's not what this question was trying to get at.
So we do have a variable down below of people teaching in a K-12 public school, which we might expand to serving as a counselor or things like that. So here, if you look at all the different variables that we're going to be combining together, we're saying, okay, so here's Kathy, and she very recently became, let's just do my example, qualified or certified as an administrator in the school year 22-23. And she is in fact serving as an administrator, and she is white. So those are all the variables that you would have to construct who I am and my experience. Would that answer the question correctly?
I think so.
Fifi, do you agree?
I think that makes sense.
Okay, so I'm looking at chat, and I'm seeing to the second question about how long until teachers are taking to get hired. They could tell something about outlier prep programs that are producing teachers who are not getting hired. So I think this has to do with our next question on this, which is how many years does it take newly credentialed teachers to get jobs in public schools? So can somebody speak to the question in chat? Do what we have down here, will it answer the use case that was put into chat? And the person who wrote it, if you want to unmute and clarify your question, please go ahead and do so.
Hi there. Sorry, this is Jana Left. I think I was ahead of the conversation, so apologies for jumping the order.
Oh, no, go ahead. I was about to go on to this next one anyway. So go ahead and state your question for the group.
Honestly, I think I was misunderstanding where the conversation was at the moment. So go ahead and proceed. And I think we're
Okay, thank you so much. All right, so then just double checking the construct that we did for the question about racial composition. So now we're on row 134, and it's how many years does it take newly credentialed teachers to get jobs? So in this case, we've once again got CTC saying, okay, these are the people who are credentialed, and we know what year we're talking about. And then we've got the idea of getting a job. And so this is where we're going to be pulling from the job classification codes. So this could be teachers, counselors, administrators. And then we're going to determine if this is happening at the LEA or school site level with our partners. And then the how many years is going to be a calculation that would be done. Actually, this is redundant. I can get rid of this one here. Where, oh no, I'm wrong, because this is the comparison point. So then we're going to have Cradle-to-Career do the comparison from the year credentialed to the staff employment start date, as we determined earlier, that the Cradle-to-Career is going to be best equipped to calculate that. So does this all still work as intended? Or conversely, are there any concerns about this approach?
This is Liberty. I think we need to still, sorry, I keep muting and unmuting. Define newly credentialed. And especially with like what Fifi was talking about, people who get different credentials at different points in time. I know that's nuanced, but I think it's important to keep in mind here.
Okay, so let's then talk through this. So clearly we need to have newly credentialed show up as a variable in these rows. So let's go ahead and add it. So then does this 5-year time frame that is used by the commission to indicate newly credentialed, is that the right thing to say? So like for the moment that I get certified as an administrator, how long does it take me to get a job as an administrator? Does that seem right?
Seems right.
And thank you, Liberty, for noting that that was a missing variable for this equation. Any other thoughts about the concept of the construction of this question?
I do have something that's been in the back of my mind, which is where does added authorizations come into the picture for teachers? So they earn a credential in one area, and then they add an authorization that allows them to teach in other subject areas or grade levels later on.
How does that get documented by the commission?
We also use document category for that to indicate whether it's an added authorization or not. But I don't think they would be considered as newly credentialed teachers because the added authorization is already on the teaching credential. So it's more like a new content area, more of an assignment, I think, rather than a new, I guess we would consider as a new credential that they were issued. Does that make sense?
So looking at the construct of this question, then, if we're saying, so let's say I was certified to teach in one area, and then I got an additional area I could teach in. It wouldn't be really possible to, would it be possible to tell if I was teaching in that new area?
We would have to issue in state for that new area. And then you can use that date perhaps to find out if, you know, they were employed in that area.
CDE, do you have the data to be able to document whether their job type changed sufficiently to align with their new authors?
Possibly, I think, and I'm not the expert on this, but I believe that the data that we collect on assignments is point in time and not necessarily, you know, if a teacher, let's say we're looking at census day, okay, that teacher is teaching English, and then in, you know, January, they start teaching math. I don't know if we capture that math because it's past the point in time, but I could be wrong on that. So we would have to, I would have to confer with our experts on that one for sure. But my initial inclination is saying, no, I don't think we would be able to capture the entirety of the school year if there are changes.
That's a good point, Liberty, because we get snapshots and then we get this, you know, data that are certified, but you're right. Things can obviously change subsequent to that. So we don't have as much real-time capacity, obviously, as you know, as we would fortunately want, but yeah.
So would it make sense to have the CDE folks just take a look at this issue and then let us know what's really feasible with the data?
Yeah, so the question is, if a teacher's subject matter changes within a school year, would we be able to capture that as a shift or not? Okay, yeah. Are you going to capture all these questions and send us?
Absolutely. Yes. So
the growing list, yeah.
we have questions that came up at last meeting, and I was going to wait until the end of this meeting and then just do a really consolidated list for each data provider where we're like, this was the question in the discussion. Please look at this thing that you named. That's why we have Beth taking notes so that we can ask you really targeted questions. So don't worry about trying to get it all down.
So yes, we'll dig into that, but I do think that this point that Ed brings up is a valid point. You know, we're talking about credential. There's also this idea of the assignments that teachers are teaching, and are they new in that space? It's one thing to be new in the classroom, but it's also something different to teach a new subject.
Mm-hmm.
The way you teach things varies depending on the subject itself. So yeah, there's always more questions, huh?
Yes, of course. Okay, I'm looking at a chat. Let's see. So some ideas from Ed about ways to do visualization. So thank you very much for that, Ed. And then some questions about Avid, whether that it's not actually a credential type. And then there's a question about how we're matching the race ethnicity of teachers to what's happening in the school. So the thing that'll be important to understand is that we're not going to be matching at the classroom level. So we have, you know, something like we'll say, okay, these are all of the students that are in K-12 in a particular area. And this is a racial and ethnic breakdown. And then we'll look at all of the teachers or administrators or counselors in that same area and look at their racial and ethnic breakdown. And you could imagine this visualized as a series of, you know, column charts. So we're like, oh, like this many of the students are Latinx and this many of the teachers are Latinx. So it's really looking at a sort of bigger level as opposed to trying to get all the way down to the classroom. So we're just understanding in general, is there an alignment? But we wouldn't be able to get much more granular than that. And part of our discussion is it might actually be the LEA level where we're going to have the most reliable data. And so that's what we have to determine. So for example, I'm looking more at the question, would it be possible to find out how many newly credentialed students, newly credentialed teachers a student had? And the answer is no, because we're not going to be like following individual students and then looking at who their teachers were, because what we're really trying to get at here is information that can inform policy and training programs. So in essence, if we have a problem in that we don't have enough teachers, and if we look back at the historical pipelines of what people majored in their undergraduate, and then if they entered teacher credentialing programs, if we see that there are just not enough people coming through those pathways, then there are actions that could be taken at a policy level or within counseling that gets done at colleges. I'm thinking, for example, in community colleges, there's a lot of students that graduate with a non-specific degree, that's sort of a liberal arts degree, which actually could be fantastic prep for the breadth and range you need to have to be like an elementary school teacher, for example. And so we could be doing more work to recruit those community college students to go on and get bachelor's degrees and enter teacher prep programs, but we're not trying to look at individual students' experiences about if they have, who their teachers were. So we're not at that grain size. I hope that makes sense to answer that question. Okay. All right. So we have about 20 minutes left in this meeting. And so what I wanted to do is just really quickly see if there were comments about the specific questions. So I'm just going to go starting. So we've talked through the earlier questions. So we got down to how many years does it take newly credentialed teachers to get jobs, which we have just finished discussing. So then I'm going to go down to 145, which is what types of jobs do newly credentialed teachers get? And so in here, we're going to have a nuance. So if we're talking about educators, my question is, here we've got type of job. So for our CDE team, would this be sufficient to answer the question about what type of jobs do newly credentialed administrators or counselors get? So Liberty or Jonathan, does this look like it's constructed appropriately for this question?
I believe so, because that should encompass all of the staff. So it's not just classroom teachers, it should be all staff.
Yeah.
So yes, that should be the appropriate metric for that, Kathy.
Great. So we'll update the documentation to reflect that shift to educators. Okay. And the next one is, how do the subjects they teach vary by the subject in which they earned their credential? And here we've gotten some helpful pointers from CDE that we're really looking at the course group master combo for the subject. Any concerns about how this metric would be constructed?
Well, for elementary, for non-secondary, it is all the same subject, right? It's elementary subjects credential, I believe,
Okay.
which is, so do they have an elementary subjects credential or multiple subject credential or a single subject credential? Is that the question? Because that, yeah. I guess this question is really, from my perspective, it would answer something about secondary, but not elementary.
Okay, so I'm seeing questions about what's going on not only in elementary, but the emerging field of the pre-K. So should we just make this, should we clarify that this is a secondary teaching assignment?
Well, I wonder at the elementary level whether it's of interest to know which grade level they're currently working in if it's a teacher.
Is that something that CDE could provide?
I believe we could based on the assignment, but it's never that simple of one grade level.
Right.
Do you want to look into that and see how feasible it would be?
I am thinking of the transitional kindergarten. There's a huge need to prepare and fill a workforce to teach TK.
Mhm.
I am remembering something from our conversation about the TK data point, but it's not coming to me. Jonathan, is there something to know there?
Yeah, I mean, it's still obviously being built out. So, I mean, any conversation about, you know, TK staffing and all that, I mean, it's a little bit premature. We know that there's obviously pending legislation around it too. So I think it's difficult to kind of commit to anything around the looking at the TK staff yet. I think, you know, we'll be there, right? But it's right now we're not in that space yet.
Okay, so then I'm going to have the CDE folks just evaluate whether even in the, you know, the numbered grades, there's something there. But we'll make a note that the ability to include TK might be something that goes down the road. I know that I've noted that there's a real interest in what's going on in early learning and care that's come up repeatedly in our meetings, and that's sort of like a whole other area that Cradle-to-Career is going to be covering. But there's going to be a planning process for that because the data sets are in transition right now between CDE and CDSS. So we'll just make a note to come back to this as a design possibility. I do see a question from the field about what's going to be used as the unique ID for staff. So we will, that is a good question. I'm not recalling where that is in this list. I think that we had that people teaching in the K-12 public school, but we've not actually gone up to the level of who the individual is. So are we going to use the seed for that data point? Or would that be just a list of individuals that would be provided by CDE to Cradle-to-Career?
I believe the seed is all that we would have.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Okay. And so let's see. Beth, if you could just make a note for that, then we can go ahead and do that. And thank you, Jenna, for the clarification about the grades. Well, we take the notes from chat and use it in our notes about the meeting. Okay. All right, so moving on. We've got the length of employment for teachers who get emergency permits. And so are there any concerns about this, knowing that the length of employment is going to be calculated by Cradle-to-Career and we're still evaluating whether we're at the school site or the LEA level? Any other things to note about this particular question?
Well, if it turns out to be feasible, I would just like to advocate for having it, being able to look at teacher retention both at the school and LEA level and in the field statewide as a whole, if possible. There are high turnover rates among staff in certain schools, and that is a concern that needs to be addressed. High turnover for administrators as well.
Ed.
So Paul brings up an interesting construct, and I don't know that it's here. It's just maybe a parking lot issue as you think forward. On a lot of these, you're going to have turbulent percentages, almost certainly, in the rates that you're going to come up with because you're going to be dealing with exceptionally small cells. Going to be absolutely true of some of the race ethnic distributions you're going to find. as you get down into small districts, and almost certainly you'll get into when you get down to the school level. And so just contemplate what that looks like, what the appropriate roll-ups are. Probably something to think about down the line, but just something wanted to at least make it present now.
Thank you, Ed. And actually, for clarification, there's a suppression policy that was recommended by during the planning process. It says you have to have at least 30 individuals for data to show it all. So that would definitely mean that there'll be a lot of suppression in small districts where information just may not be available. Okay. So then we get down to how many teachers are entering through emergency permits that then become fully credentialed. And I'm assuming that we can do this for not just teachers, but also administrators and counselors, or is that not the case? Are there emergency credentials for those individuals? Fifi, do you have a sense, I mean, for the credential type, is that applicable to administrators?
Yes. Yeah, we have a document term that identifies whether it's an intern or permit. And so both administrators, administrative services, and counselors, I believe, they don't have permits, but I think we have teacher librarian permits, and they might have interns for counselors. I forget which PPS, pupil personnel services, have an intern.
So does that change credential type as a data point to bring in those other types of educator roles?
I guess we can identify it as a credential type.
Okay, but we'll make a note for when we're working with you on documentation that we need to make sure that we're identifying all those different educator roles, just to double check.
Okay, sounds good.
All right, and then we go down to in what type of schools are teachers who enter all those different other ways. Basically looking at the relationship of people that are coming in through the faster route into various types of schools. So we're looking at a very similar set of data points here. So are there any thoughts on this one, or are we good to go? It's pretty good. And then we've got how many are ultimately becoming fully credentialed. Oops, I think that actually we have, this is a duplicate. My apologies. I think actually 206 is the same as 218. So then we look at how the licensing pathways vary by race and ethnicity. So I think we've already discussed those. Any comments on that one before we move on? Okay, and then we've got teacher retention rates varying by race and ethnicity. So here again, we're going to be looking at staff service years as something that'll be calculated by Cradle-to-Career. And then the final question is, do the retention rates differ by licensing pathways? So any final comments on this one? Okay, so this is where a lot of those building blocks that we built make it easier to go along the way. All right, so I just want to go back to chat because I saw there's a lot of chat messages, and I'm going to actually put it up on the screen that's in front of me so I can read it more easily to make sure we covered everyone's comments. Let's see, we talked about a bunch of these. I apologize, I'm going a little bit slow. We've talked about the matching for teacher data. So there's a question, how will this initiative capture how many teachers leave the preparation, so leave the profession and what type of preparation they received. Yes, that was one of the questions we just reviewed. So we want to be understanding retention issues. One of the things that's not shown in this list of variables is that we will be doing a match to the larger employment data set to figure out where people go when they leave public education, what kind of industries are they employed in, and does that change how much money they're making. I'm seeing there's a lot of concern about having things that cover the P23 space, especially as we're working on credentials there. That is, we'll make sure that's included in the record as something for future consideration. Let's see, we've got this question of what does it mean by subject in which they earned a credential? So that would be, I think that subject is, oh shoot, I'm not going to be able to answer this straight up. What we'll make sure is that the documentation makes that clear. There's a number of different data points that we've defined to clarify what we mean, because there are terms that are specific to data points, but not necessarily the way we talk about things together. Let's see. I see that Ed's noting that we need to have a bridge from CSU to CTC. That will be part of the master data management solution, where we're sort of matching person records across multiple data sets, which will help. It's similar to the seed, which I mentioned is a similar sort of power match, where you're taking a lot of different variables and comparing them to identify who are the same people. And we're going to have a much more powerful engine because we'll have more data points for individuals once Cradle-to-Career gets built. I'm seeing more people saying they really want school site data if possible. And then there's a question of, will we have data on retention rates by geography? Yes. So one of the things that will be in the variables that you can slice by is that you can go by geographic region. So you'll be able to go bigger than just a school site or an LEA, depending on what gets determined based on the data. All right. Any final comments before we close out?
Kathy, this is Liberty. I guess one more comment or thought that I have when talking about teachers that leave the workforce.
Yeah.
We're California centric. We don't know once they leave the state, and with current trends and declines in our population in California, I think that we will see some information that we just can't answer. So important to keep in mind.
That is such a good point. And particularly for districts that are close to our borders, Lake Tahoe is always in the worst place because so many people go work in Nevada. Unfortunately, we did ask, there is a data sharing agreement that California has signed on to that allows for exchanges of employment information across states, but it's constructed in such a way that we could never take that information and put it into a public dashboard. It's only available for highly specific research requests. So that will be a pretty big caveat that we have to place. All right, I'm going to share my other screen. And Sydney is going to close this out.
Yes, thank you so much, everyone, for taking the time out to join us today. So in preparation for the next meeting, notes will be sent to the data providers on final content to be shared at the governing board meeting on August 10th. That meeting is virtual, by the way. Please do not show up anywhere in Sacramento looking for the board meeting. And lastly, do we have any volunteers who are willing to present the work of this task force at the August 10th board meeting? So please unmute and let us know if you are willing to volunteer. Any takers? We may have to volunteer someone, which we don't want to do. Okay. If not, we might be reaching out to you. You might be one of the lucky winners. who get to present at the task force or at the governing board meeting on August 10th. So we might reach out to you. Stay tuned for that. And if you are willing to volunteer and you just couldn't unmute yourself in time because you were so excited, please feel free to email either myself or Kathy or even that general info inbox as well, and let us know if you're willing to volunteer. It's probably just going to be about a 10-minute presentation, just presenting the work of this task force. So if we have any takers after the meeting, please get in contact with us. Otherwise, thank you so much for joining, and we appreciate everyone's time. Thank you.
One thing I noted, there's a question that just popped up in chat, which is there a summary of the questions that we weren't able to answer? We'll have that be part of the report out to the board, because part of what the governing board is there to do is to be thinking strategically toward the future and understanding the type of questions that are emerging, that are of interest, where we may not yet be at the place where we can visualize some of those data points. We'll be letting the board know so they can think about that as they think about the future work of Cradle-to-Career. All right. Well, thank you, everyone, for a very productive meeting, and we'll be following up with the data providers with your homework assignments.